inspiration for Sandhill, for me personally, was having experience in college of dormitory living that was very profound for me. I really enjoyed being with peers in a somewhat intense living situation. Of course, in college, it wasn't people picking each other based on values. It was having similar test scores, which is not the way I would suggest that you pick who you live with. But I found it very, very stimulating. I loved it. I loved that intensity. I happened to pick a college that didn't allow cars, and it was in a rural area, so you didn't leave or disperse. Everyone lived in dormitories. So I went through that period and then worked in the job world for 2 years and felt that my life slowed down. And the thing that I had really liked about college was missing now. I still lived in group houses, but it didn't have the same intensity or stimulation. So I paused at the ripe age of 23 and thought, maybe I did this backwards. Instead of focusing on what I would do first and then fill in the people afterwards, maybe I should start with the people and fill in what I do. So I backed up, quit my job, got together with a number of people, about 10 or 12 of us who were friends in college, and talked about this idea of community. And meanwhile, I'd stumbled into something about the concept, and I actually had read a book called A Walden 2 Experiment, which was about the first 5 years of Twin Oaks, written by Kat Kincaid. I can remember, this is so important in my life, that I can remember where I was sitting at a reading table in the public library in Memphis, Tennessee, visiting a friend, when I came across an excerpt from the book in a current issue of a magazine which still exists called Psychology Today. And then I thought, oh, this gels for me. Intentional community might be something to replicate what I liked about the college experience. In any event, it led to a meeting then of friends, and out of that there were 3 of us out of that 12 that were interested in, okay, let's do this. Others thought, oh, it sounds good, but I don't think I can pause what I'm doing in my life to do it. The idea I had at the time was, okay, that makes sense, this is a theory, who knows what's going to happen. If we actually build it, well, then we could attract some of these other 9 people to join us if we create the reality of it. So basically we did. I mean, those 3 of us plus the partner of one of the people that was not at that meeting joined us, and so there were 4 original people. And we did it. We wanted to be in the Midwest because we were all from the Midwest, and our friends were, people we knew best were there. It was the climate we knew. We would be within a day's drive of our friends and our family, so we did that. We picked land basically based on where it was cheap. We did some research to find out where land would be inexpensive. Our search criteria were pretty naive. I mean, when I look back today over what we did, I think we didn't know anything about, I mean, how I value community today or what I would look for, that wasn't what we were thinking about when we sought the land. And we lucked into some good things. We wound up buying a place that had really good gardening space, and that became central to our identity. But we didn't know when we bought this land that we wanted that or that it was important to us. So there's a lot of ways in which we were just lucky. I think there were a couple really key things, and then this will be enough of my founding story. We thought we would grow by people that we knew would then come to the reality that we created, and that's how we grow. And that never happened. All of the people that ultimately joined the community found out about us after we were on the land. They were not prior friends. They would come and visit, but they never joined. We never had a single person to join the community from friends before. That was where we started, but we never grew that way. We had to open up our doors to people we did not know based on our vision and what we stood for. And that ultimately succeeded. I would say that while I am appalled at how naive I was at the beginning, there were ways in which we were saved by our ignorance, because not knowing how ignorant we were foolish enough to start. And then we were lucky enough to get extra energy when we were close to quitting that kept us to continue. And so we were stubborn and we were lucky. And that's, I guess, the main thing I distilled from it. That's my 5 minutes.
So we were also stubborn and lucky, I
Cool.
suppose, to get started. Yeah, Dancing Rabbit's story also starts in college. There was a group of us living at a student co-op at Stanford called Synergy, and it was a really magical experience there to get to live in community while in college. So even more intense than some of the dorm situations. It was, we were already practicing consensus gardening, figuring out how to live cooperatively together, cooking and cleaning with each other. And so it was a really profound experience. And so a lot of us, saw that and wanted to continue doing that after we graduated. Dancing Rabbit also started with a mission, an activist mission of trying to change the world, and that was really central from the beginning. We had, for a couple of years, we had potlucks and an email mailing list, and we would get a group together that was sort of an ever-changing cast of characters of who would come to those potlucks. But there was a core group that coalesced, and eventually we moved into a house together in Berkeley, California. And when we made that shift to actually living together was when things really took off. And that was in 1995. We started living together. We started meeting every day. We really started figuring out what our vision and values and systems were. And we moved to Missouri in 1996. And we were lucky to have connected with the Fellowship for Intentional Community. So we couldn't claim quite as much ignorance as Sand Hill Farm when they got started. But we really took advantage of the network and of the movement, and drew on their experiences. I also read Walden 2 Experiment and all the other books that I could absorb on community. I read every back issue of Communities magazine from the Stanford Library when I was in college. Yeah, there was some crazy stuff in there. And we specifically chose to be near an existing community, and so that's how we came to Scotland County, and I've given you all some of the details from there, so I'll keep mine pretty brief. But it was through sort of it does really help to have a certain tenacity, never giving up, because there will be so many chances to just stop. Like there's always going to be. You need something driving forward to keep that community going until it really has inertia of its own, to have that momentum to keep going. And it was really probably, it was probably 5 to 8 years after we moved here where I actually thought, like, wow, this is really happening. Like we can sort of rest back and be like, yep, this is going to keep going. Like, because those first 5 years, it was pretty easy to feel like if something bad happens, we could definitely, if we lost the right people, like this could fall apart. And so it took a while to really feel stable, and now it feels very stable in that way.
Okay, so I'm going to tell a story about a community that I tried to found unsuccessfully, and then the story of Red Earth Farms, because they're very different stories. Neither community started when I was in college, except that when I was in college was when I first went overseas. I went abroad for a year when I was a junior in college, and then after I graduated, I went to Russia and spent most of my 20s, most of the 1990s in Russia, Ukraine, Hungary, and working with environmental groups and student exchange programs in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And by my late 20s, I was working from dawn till midnight for different causes, and was getting burned out, as were many of my colleagues, both other expatriates who were living there and also local groups we were working with. It seemed like everyone was getting burned out. And we had this brilliant idea of an international activist community somewhere in Central Europe, that people from Eastern Europe and Western Europe could come to this community, have it as a base where we're walking our talk, and from there go out into the world and do our activism. But be doing all of the things that we're promoting, energy efficiency, renewable energy, growing our own food, catching rainwater, and so forth. And so we began talking about this at international gatherings. There's an annual gathering called Ecotopia, and we spent a few years talking with people there. We'd have groups of 50, 60 people just like coming up with like what country it should be in, what things should we do, and we decided on Croatia. because you could get there easily from east and west without a lot of visa hassles. And we had a core group that was like, yeah, in 1999, I'll come with you, meet you there. And so in 1999, actually in 1998, I realized I should probably visit some intentional communities before trying to start one. I had no idea about Communities Magazine or anything like that, but I thought I should maybe visit and maybe even live in one for a little while. So I came back to the States and went to the Twin Oaks Communities Conference in Virginia, where I met people from dozens of different communities, and I said, where are the environmental activist communities? I want to start one, so I want to go visit one in this country. Well, nobody really could think of one, except there's this place in Missouri that just bought their land a year ago. Maybe you should go and see them. And so I came out and I spent a week at Sandhill and a week at Dancing Rabbit, which then was a field and a couple of, like, a sort of mostly built Rachel's house, which I helped plaster, and the timber frame, helped put the floor in. So there was very little here. But I loved the people and the vision of the place. It really called to me. I was like, okay, if they're doing it here, I can do it there. And I spent about 8 months living at Twin Oaks, and then went back over to Croatia on a cargo ship with my partner. And we went and we met with the group. We found the place that we were going to do it. And the other people that had committed to come didn't show up. And so, like, people would come through and visit us, and we were learning Croatian, and we were making local connections and working with the politicians. And within, I don't know, 4 months, we had run out of money. The local group had lost their political support. The politics of the region changed, and the economic system changed. So they actually had to leave the town that we were in Istria, where we were trying to get it started. And we ended up having to leave too. So we came back to the States, and a few years later I was like, maybe I should visit that place in Missouri again. And I came out here, loved it. They were much further along at that point, it felt like anyway, in 2000. And so in 2002, New Year's Day, I moved out here. Lived here for a few years, was on the board of directors. And my new partner and I wanted to live together and do homesteading together, but he did not like the density of Dancing Rabbit, and his vision was more of like homesteads that are more or less self-sufficient, interconnected, intersufficient, but not the dense village, more the eco-farms that are around the eco-village. So like providing food and things for each other and for the village, and clothing and fuel and whatever else we could grow from the land or produce from animals. And so we spent a year working on figuring out how that could look, and during that year we found out that the land next door was for sale, and another couple joined us, and the four of us came up with the name, found a loan for the land, and bought Red Earth Farms. And at that point, for a few years, as Tony said, we really weren't sure it was going to get off the ground, because until we came up with money for our leaseholds and drafted leases and came up with all those documents, we were basically squatting on the land that was owned by the angel investor who had bought it for our community, which was not an enticing position for other people to join because they didn't feel like they had any security. So it wasn't actually until we had our founding documents, our board of directors, our nonprofit status, a bank account that allowed us to lease land, and we had leases written up, that we actually started getting more members. And that's the point where Red Earth Farm started to really take off. And so now we've leased almost all our land. We have only a few acres left to lease. And we are, after 8 years, getting a lot closer to actually providing a lot of our own food and other things that people need to share with our neighbors and to sell to the wider public.
Great. All right, so I want to draw out a couple themes that we've already heard. One of them is that there's a lot you can't control. Like, everybody's talking about luck. Allison's example of like the local politics were part of what killed your project. Like, you don't necessarily have control over a lot of this stuff, and so I want to point that out. And also, there are things that you have control over, and in all cases, the success stories here are ones where people learned from others, whether it was reading books, reading Communities Magazine, going and visiting other communities, whatever that took on. I mean, when Laird was doing this, there weren't so many of those resources available, but even that, it was, reading a book is what kind of crystallized it for them. And the other thing is that there's 3 different variations here that can all work. One is community as a home base for activism, where you can get together a bunch of people who are socially aware and want a home base where they are sharing a culture with them, where they're demonstrating what they're walking their talk, but they're intending to be outward facing in a lot of ways. And then one is community as activism, like Dancing Rabbit is an example of a demonstration project, where this is the activism that people do. Not only, but a big part of it is by living your lives in a way as a demonstration. And the other one is just community as home, which is where Sandhill started, like having that close-knit sense of a group.
What was the first one you said?
Community as a home-based activism.
Oh.
The other first one? Which one did you?
I thought they were saying community as activism and community as a home base.
Community as a home base for activism, community as activism, and community as home. So there's 3 different layers there. Okay, great. So what are your questions?
So we are still doing activism outside. Is it only the community of the art as activism right now? Or is it also a home base for other?
It is, I'd say most of our activism flows through our community in terms of demonstration, bringing people here to do classes, tours, visitor program, going out and speaking specifically about Dancing Rabbit. There are people who I think are very active in like the natural building movement, but it is hard when you choose to locate to a rural area. Most sort of like what you would call traditional activism happens in cities, and so like if your goal is to really be like a political activist and you want to set up a community with that as a focus, then it really helps to be near places where there's politics. And there are politics in Scotland County, but it's not something where we can't really do that locally. And so we haven't, whereas if we were an hour outside of Washington, D.C. or New York City or something like that, then I think that it would be more opportunity for people to be doing more like direct activism, whereas ours is sort of a activism on sustainability, but it's an activism that's through demonstration rather than through political action or protest.
And
I think it depends on your issues.
Sure.
You have a smaller palette in rural areas, but you remember the stories yesterday about the CAFO stuff I was talking about. That's activism in the environment, and it's a rural issue, not an urban issue. You're going to have a smaller number of choices in a rural area, but you will have some.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's true that a lot of political activism with big decision makers happens in cities, but people who are based at Sandhill and Dancing Rabbit and Red Earth Farms have done things like go and demonstrate, go and talk to commissioners in the county seat about issues like the CAFO situation. Also, we started a farmers market in our county. People from all 3 communities started a farmers market that's still going and actually expanding. One of the branches of it started in Memphis, and now there's going to be one at Dancing Rabbit. So there's going to be 2 locations of the Scotland County farmers markets. And a lot of individuals do things like go and demonstrate against the war in Iraq, for example, or go and protest at weapons manufacturing places, or go and learn about nonviolent communication and conflict transformation so that they can serve in that way. So like there's a broad way that individuals choose to participate in local and national politics. But I think as a community, none of these 3 communities is dedicated to activism as a community. A fourth community in our area is actually committed to service and activism as a community. It's over in La Plata, near Kirksville, the Possibility Alliance. Yeah, that's one of their founding tenets of the community.
Can I ask what kind of activism they do? What kind of social change?
All different kinds. Like they work with Catholic worker. They have a close sister connection with Catholic worker communities in St. Louis and Kansas City, which are serving the poor. They go as a group or as individuals and protest weapons manufacture and sale. They write a lot of letters to decision makers, Congress people. Yeah, their members individually make a lot of choices about what they are passionate about, and I'm not sure exactly if there are issues that they've agreed on as a whole community other than serving the poor.
I want to make a distinction. I think you have a choice, and you could do both. It's not, you don't have to go one way or the other, but as an activist, one choice is to highlight what you think is not working and call attention to it. For some people, that's what they think all activism is. However, a different choice is, let's highlight an alternative or work on that and try to do education where there's openings around that. I do that kind of activism. I feel no less an activist because I've made that choice. However, those who prefer the other path in some cases feel I'm not an activist. But I mean, I just want to point out there's different framework here.
Right.
And I'm not here to say one's better than the other, but I think you have, it's a choice you have. A person, if you want to be an activist, how do you want to do that?
Yeah, and personally, I spent a lot of time, like, you know, decades of my life doing those holding actions, like trying to prevent the harmful things from happening. And it takes a lot of energy. It really is very draining, and that was why I felt the need to be based in a place that was actually demonstrating positive solutions to the problems that we were encountering. So I think it is possible to do both, and in fact I think community is a great springboard for that kind of activism, because you can come home to be restored and rejuvenated.
Let's get another question in here. So Fiona?
I'd like to hear from all of you. What were your biggest challenges?
I would say that, in fact, I think this is a fundamental challenge for any group, is how do you solve problems? And I think I've said something about this in class, in particular when the stakes are high and people feel like I am holding a core value that matters a lot to me and that I believe matters to the group. I mean, this isn't just me imposing a personal value, but one that I thought I had alignment with in the group, and it's leading me to a different conclusion than you've got. How do you handle that moment? Is a watershed thing. If you can do that in a way that people feel whole at the result afterwards and feel closer, now you've got gold. And if you don't, you have lead.
Yeah, I think for Dancing Rabbit, like, there were sort of two phases. I think when we were in the founding phase, the hardest challenge was getting people to really commit and be part of our core group and to really engage fully and to be there. And so, like, it often felt like we were such a small group trying to make this incredibly big thing happen. And then once you're actually doing it, then in a lot of ways the hardest thing is, as Laird said, like being able to get along, being able to resolve conflicts, being able to do that. And now, certainly other groups might have different experience. Like we did very well at like having a clear and compelling vision. We didn't have trouble finding the money to do the project that we wanted. You know, we were able to we didn't run into like legal issues or something like that. It was really about getting the people together to make it happen and having it feel stable that those people were committed was the hardest part in the starting process.
I think that so in Croatia, the main challenges were getting up and running. We didn't have the people, the commitment from the people. We had a clear vision, but we didn't have the people there to actually put it into practice. 2 people didn't seem to be enough, especially when we were a couple. So it seemed like we really needed 3, at least, to get going. There's a reason why FIC feels like 3 is the minimum number to call yourselves a community. And at Red Earth Farms, we started getting going when we had 3. We actually started with 4, but then 1 left, and we still had 3, and it felt like we were still going to make it. But it was a little touch and go, and at that point, the challenges were really like interpersonal. Like that's where, I mean, I guess I'm echoing the same stuff. Is how, like, given that you have a common vision and a common goal, what decisions are you going to try to make together, and how are you going to let people make what decisions are you going to agree to disagree on? Dancing Rabbit, living very densely, making decisions by consensus, a lot of common paths and roads and infrastructure, making decisions about land use plans all together. Red Earth Farms, much more dispersed. So our homesteads are farther apart, And our common vision is about providing small pieces of ground that people can gain sustenance from and support the wider community from. So it's less about the cohesiveness of the community as about our collective vision of being collective, but also having this. People have more of an individualistic streak at our community, and so it's kind of been a challenge to marry those two things, like, basically how to get a bunch of hermits to get along. And those hermits want to get along, luckily. Like, that's why they're in community and not on their own land somewhere. So we have the motivation. We have a lot of community glue. We do a lot of things together, but like walking that line has been tricky for our community. How much unity are we aiming for?
What did your parents think about all this when you first started out? Or, like, how did they manage dealing with doing something that's several standard deviations away from the mainstream? Like, how did you sort of deal with that?
I'm going to repeat that for the camera. So the question is about what did your parents think, and you were going so far away from the mainstream in your decisions?
The answers to this, you're getting 3 individuals, and they're not a monolithic answer for each community.
We have different parents.
Yes.
Parents, like community members, come in all packages. So my father in particular felt he'd wasted investing in my college education. He felt he was a disappointment because he felt somebody who was really engaged and cared about the world would be in the world more directly. He thought that should be done through business. I think that's a point of view. I think there's legitimacy to it. Didn't appeal to me at all. I'm totally happy with my choice. Never got his approval. He felt I was chicken. It's kind of interesting because that's not a word that's associated with me very much. But it's not my image of myself, but it was his image of me. So I proceeded entirely without his approval. My mother was more accepting she saw I liked what I was doing, and she was more willing to give weight to that. I don't think she was enthusiastic. I'll tell you a story just very briefly that highlights, this is my mother who was the more accepting one. My son was born, first child born in the community. In 1981, community was 7 years old. It was I caught my son in our bedroom when he was born. One of the most powerful experiences in my life. Been up through the night. I wasn't doing the work that his mother was, but nonetheless, it was a very powerful experience. And so the first call I made later in that day was to my mother about her grandson. And her first statement was, "I'm sorry that you decided to have a bastard." That was her first comment to me after I'd been up all night. And it was, where did that come? But it was about, she was stretched that far, and it was hard for her. I was making choices that were different. It wasn't that she never had a connection with my son, but that was the first statement to me. And that was the accepting parent. Okay.
It gets better.
Yeah. So I feel pretty lucky in that my parents had an attitude of, whatever our kids do, as long as they're happy, as long as they're not hurting anyone, that's fine with us. And they actually lived up to that. Like, they told us that whenever I was growing up, and they really did that. And my sisters and I have taken very different paths, and yet my parents seem supportive of all of us. I think they enjoy visiting my sisters more because it's more what they're comfortable with. They're used to suburban middle class existence, and so that's more comfortable to them. But they are supportive of Dancing Rabbit, and they don't really get it on a deep level. Like, there's often times where they're like, especially early on, it was sort of like, "How's the farming?" And it's like, "Oh, that's not really exactly what we're doing," And it's, and I think that. But then what I learned in my life was that you can feel like your parents are being critical of you, and then if you can get a chance to hear them describe what you're doing to someone else when they're actually putting the positive spin on it, it'd be like, "Oh, you actually do get what I'm doing, and you actually can at least make it sound positive." Maybe if that's not your full internal embracing of it. But and so it was interesting, though. I actually got more there was just like, it was relatively brief, but there was a period of like my sisters being like, you're wasting your life, I can't believe you're doing this, you could do so much more if you did something else, you know, and like, and I think that that's in some ways normal when people don't understand what you're doing, and it's hard because you are, I mean, in some ways, like I don't feel like I'm rejecting my parents or rejecting my upbringing. Like for me, it's about like being like, you know, thank you so much for raising me so well and having this, you know, great life that I've grown up with. How do we take that to the next level where we're, you know, have, you know, even better sense of connection and community and a better relationship to the environment and a better standard of living? And yet for them it feels like a rejection because, you know, I'm not pursuing, you know, like money or the business world or, you know, the physical comforts in life that was in some ways I think the most important thing for people, you know, or felt like it for people to be exploring in the last century was like increasing their, you know, sort of material existence. And now I feel like we're taking it to like increasing our, you know, social, you know, existence and our relationship to the wider world. So it's been a mix, but I feel like my parents are generally supportive, but and it took a little while. Like the first couple of years were a little hard, I think.
So I had it really easy. Because my parents, like there's a picture in my baby book of me in a baby carriage at a protest when my parents were in college. And when we left Pennsylvania when I was 8, looking for a new place to live, like my parents had a map where they had marked all of the nuclear power plants in the country so that we didn't choose a home near one of them. And they're back to the landers. They live in the Vermont woods. I grew up running around, you know, milking the goats and watching the chickens and gathering eggs, and we had bees and an orchard and all of that. So my mother started an organic bakery in a building that my dad built that's passive solar next to their house. You know, it's like they get it. They come and they visit and they love it and they're thrilled. The main thing that my mother didn't like about my Croatian experiment was that I was far, far away. She was really, really happy when I moved back to the States. And so, like, for a while they were worried that my brother or I would become an investment banker or, like, you know, an airline executive or something, rebel against their values. But we both sort of got it. And my brother's a political science professor at UVM and living in a sort of low-income housing collective thing. And you know, they have a garden and stuff too. So it's something that was imbued in me at an early age, that you can question authority and you can put all the crazy bumper stickers on your bike that you want and, like, you know, go do that. So they dig it. Yeah, it's my hope that raising a child in community, that she'll imbue some of those family values on a community level, you know, that she'll learn from so many different adults about different ways of being, and that family, as you're saying, family is so important. It's the central, you know, way that we connect with people from our youth to our old age, and at least in the best of cases it can be. And community is like our chosen family. And so I'm hoping that she will grow up learning that she has blood family and chosen family, and her parents have that, and, you know, she can make choices about who she has connections with in her life and how to strengthen them, and hopefully we're teaching her how to strengthen those connections. Character traits of founders specifically.
That you see in yourself and in other founders.
You already said stubborn.
Tenacity. Well, stubbornness, tenacity, I think I see probably in all of us to some degree, and in most founders. Although I think it has to be balanced with, like, a realism, you know, what is actually possible here, and is it necessary? Like, there has to be a sense, I think, that what you're doing is necessary, because it takes so much energy to get started. And if there's an existing community that is more or less what you're looking for, it can be much wiser to save your energy and work with an existing community. You know, my vision of the community that I wanted to start was very different from what Dancing Rabbit was when I moved here. But Dancing Rabbit had most of what I was looking for.
I think it's really important to have good social skills, but it was really important for, I think, for Dancing Rabbit, and probably for a lot of communities, to have a good mix of social skills and, like, sort of logistical or technical skills, and that it depends on your community whether that means a way to make money or a way to build buildings. But I think especially just things like someone who can handle money, someone who could write at least read a legal document, if not write one. If it's all one or the other, if you're all accountants, you might have a problem if no one has good social skills. And if you're all have really great social skills, but no one can, make a spreadsheet, you might have problems. So there's it's good to have, and in an ideal world, all of you have all of those skills, but that it doesn't have to be that way. I think I think if you want to succeed as a founder and then actually get to live in your community for a long time, it helps to have humility and to not think you're hot shit all the time and that you're better than other people. And I feel and to really be able to, the hardest part is you've created this thing and then it's sort of it's like raising a child or something where it's there's a period where you're in total responsibility and somewhat total control, and then you have to release that, and they are their own being, and you are part of that still, but you no longer have that control, and you have to be able to navigate that, and that takes a certain grace and humility to be able to do that.
One of the ways I would frame the piece that Tony mentioned about balance is, so it's a dichotomy you hear a lot in groups, is product people and process people. I don't know if that terminology is familiar, but I think you have to be able to work both sides of the aisle. You have to think, how can they play well together, that dynamic. I think you need to be fairly self-aware about power. That is, what power you have and how to see what's in the room and deal authentically with it. Self-awareness is going to be very crucial to be successful. If you have a distorted view, either consistently undercutting the power, it's not going to be believable. And if you're ignorant of the ways in which you've got power and use it, that will be very brittle, and people will not be drawn to be around you. I think there's a little bit different than the way Tony expressed it. I think you need to be able to articulate well. Some of that could be writing, some of it's oral. There's a way you need to be inspirational. Now, inspirational isn't always about oratory or well written. It can also be it comes in different forms. It can be through doing and stuff. But there's a way in which founders need to be inspirational to draw other people to what it is you're doing. And I think Tony mentioned humility, which is pretty good. I'm going to talk about transparency. So you've gotten to see my version of it in a way that I've never hoped to actually have to do, over the fact that I had I'm still processing a very difficult personal thing that I didn't expect to have happen in the context of the course, and yet here we are. And it's it's my job. I am in some ways, I am a founder of this course. There's a power thing that's analogous to this situation because of my relationship to you as students. And so, okay, this is the hand I'm dealt. I need to deal with that. And you can see how you relate to me as a result of what I'm willing to share around that. And that's a very powerful piece of how effective or ineffective founders can be. Sometimes what's hard is the group wants you to be faultless. And that's an impossible standard. You've got to not allow yourself to be placed in that place. And you've got to be able to authentically admit when you've made a mistake, without groveling on the floor. You have to be able to get up. Your failures, your mistakes as a founder will be spectacular. You get to do it in front of everybody.
I think the thing I want to add that hasn't been said is that, and I agree with all of what Tony and Laird said, is that we're all co-founders. If you think of a founder as a single person, it's very unlikely that something's going to get off the ground. And yet, in each of those people who are co-founders, not a single one of them has to embody all of these qualities that we're talking about. If you have them in your 3 people or your 5 people or whatever your founding group is, then you're good. Chad is really the visionary of Red Earth Farms. He's the one that had the nucleus of the idea of how the community would look. And I was more like the networker, the people person, the process person, the outward face of the community. Sure, I'll call the guy and see if the land is for sale, kind of thing. And Kim is a very supportive person. She's very good with numbers and words and things on paper. She's also very good at gardening. She's got a lot of like skills for nurturing people and supporting people, and that was very important for us. And so like the three of us together really combined a lot of those skills. You don't have to have it in one person. Yeah. I feel like there was something else too.
I have one more piece that I didn't say, which is that I don't know how clear it is. I think it's very essential. It'll make a big difference to your potential for success as a founder is the ability to bridge between people when tension exists in the group. You often look to leaders, founders, to be able to hold two sides of a thing so that you can see how there's a legitimacy and that there's a way to work through it. You have to be able to demonstrate a bridge in opposition. If you can't do that, it's very, very hard.
It's a piece I can add here too that I think was a key difference between my not successful group and my successful group, and that was that we had a sense of humor in the second group in a way that we were so horribly serious about everything in the first group that it just killed it. There was no lightness available. When you're doing really hard work, it really helps. Okay, ready for another question? Okay, Teddy, you're next one.
I guess I wanted to kind of make an observation and ask you a question. The observation being that there's three communities of varying size and length of operation. They are all very similar in their goals of organic living, sustainable living, those kinds of things. Living in community is also a standard, but there are fairly different models. And I almost think that might be a starting point of like understanding, and it seems like Allison, for instance, wasn't, or your husband or whatever, wasn't capable of living in DR because of the social dynamic rather than the sustainable dynamic, and so it's almost like an easier goal to just kind of put down, okay, we're going to have a sustainable community, but then the actual, we kind of just go, I want to live in a community, but that has a very wide breadth of interpretations and models for how it operates. I mean, Sandhill is very, very close in income sharing, and it's a small group, and DR is a little bit, it's larger, but there's not income sharing, there's a different dynamic, and Red Earth has a totally different dynamic. And I'm just wondering, when starting a community, if you put in that much effort to going, okay, here are going to be the community, these are going to be the social structures whereby the community operates, or if you just kind of said, let's go live in community, and then everything kind of organically grew, or were you very precise about, okay, these are the way we're going to interact with each other, this is how much money we're going to share, because it seems like almost like that's the defining characteristic of whether a community, how it works, because it almost seems like their whole concept was, let's start a community. That was the basis. You didn't even know you were in a farm. You just said, I want to live in community, let's go make that happen. So
I don't recommend it, but that is what we did.
Well, that's what I'm asking. I mean, I'm wondering if that it seems like that should be a central focus of the starting point, is determining those structures, or do you think trying to get too defined early on would stifle it, and you really need to sort of just let it grow organically based on who shows up?
I think it helps to have a general sense. I think that if you have a very specific idea of how each family will do its economics, then it's not going to work. But the Dancing Rabbit vision of a community of communities was there from the beginning, and the Red Earth vision of like a community of homesteads was there from the beginning. We weren't saying like every homestead should have 1 to 20 people. We were just like, yeah, come and make a proposal, like show us what you want to do. And we could have ended up with a 20-person co-housing community as part of Red Earth Farms, but we didn't. But we were open to something like that as well. So I think a loose idea is helpful, but being too precise about it is not.
Yeah, I might describe it as like an impressionistic painting where you've like laid out the sort of general thing, and if you stand back far enough, it looks pretty clear, but you get close and you realize there's a lot, there's just going to be a lot of diversity, because not only are you going to get a diversity of people, how introverted, how extroverted, but they're going to change over time. Like, people are different when they have young children, when they get older, just as they age, people go through different phases of how much they want close connection, how much they want personal space, how much they want to be in each other's business. And so one of the challenges that Dancing Rabbit had is that it has this vision of a 500-person village. And so a lot of people are like, yeah, that's what I want to live in. And they have this vision of it. And that was not what we were when we were 10 people. And so there was a disjunct between our vision of what we said we wanted to create and the type of social interactions that you could expect in that vision and the social interactions that you were having on a day-to-day basis. Some people came because they loved what we were right then. And some people came because, and it was a spectrum or a mix, you know, how much is it for the here and now versus the vision? And for the people who were here for the vision, and it took years and years and it didn't happen, they left because they weren't thriving in the small community that we were at the beginning. And as the community has grown, there have been people who have left because it's no longer the small community that they fell in love with. And so we knew that we were going to experience all of those different things along the way and tried to be clear with that. But I think, yes, it can be really good just to like paint that picture of like, hey, we want to eat together. Like a lot of communities do it by how often they're going to eat together or how closely they're going to live together and what their finances are. Those paint the rough picture of how you're going to relate socially to each other. Or whether you're going to share a spiritual or interpersonal process together would be another thing that would describe your community in broad strokes of what it might look like.
I have 2 points to make on this. One is, I think a crucial question is, how much do you intend membership in your group to mean about the interwovenness of lives because you're in this group? Lacking any conversation about it, you will get a broad mix usually, and that will be a tension point in terms of how much the group coalesces. I see this all the time as a consultant, ambiguity around that, disappointment of those who don't feel people are involved enough, and then pressure to conform or be involved in a way that people felt they didn't sign up for and were never interested in, and it leads to a diffusion and a lack of cohesion in the group. And some of the, I want to honor what Tony said, that people are going to change their minds. There's not one right answer. You're not going to pin it down exactly, but the more you can be clear about what you're trying for, the more likely you're going to have cohesion and like what you get. Okay, and you screen for that. That's one thing to mention. In a lot of groups, very few groups actually understand that at the front end. They only discover it after to their dismay at what they've got. So I want to alert you to that. Now that's one thing. The other point I want to make is, I think it's what I recommend strongly to anybody starting is try to sit down and get clear, well, what's crucial to me about when I say community? What do I need to be the elements of that to be? And what are negotiable? I mean, so distill it down into and it's not going to be a list of 25 things. It might be 5 or something. I don't know. What is your personal things that you need to have, and what is your answer to those things? I mean, what do you mean by, this is important? What is important in terms of actions, amount of time, how it fits in with other parts of my life? Define those. Because those are crucial screens then. Can we fit? And so if there's 5 and you only match on 4, I guarantee you that 5th one's going to rub. And you're going to have to know that. And the sooner you identify that and can figure that out, the more intelligent you can make a decision about whether this is going to work or not. So but what's crucial? What do I mean by that? What do I need on it? And what is my tolerance of deviation from the perfect that's acceptable? If you can do all of that, you're going to be in much, much better shape about making good choices about who you're living with.
Yeah, that comes back again to that tenacity and discernment piece that I was mentioning earlier, like holding to the things that feel central and getting clear about them, and being clear about like where the wiggle room is.
And I think we've seen, I mean, one of the other questions is, so there's the things that you're going to get from each other as a community, and then how are people going to get their other needs met? And at Dancing Rabbit, we've been clear, like as a village, we've got these sets of things in common. And then if you want deeper connection, you're going to meet that with subgroups within the community. If you're in the city, you might say like, we're a community that's going to do this together. And then of course people are going to go out and they're going to like be part of their musical group or their dance thing or their political activism, whatever, and they're going to get those needs met outside of the community. And so like just being clear that because people are going to come and they're going to love the 5 things that you've laid out, but that's not going to be everything about them. They're going to have other needs beyond that as well.
Yeah, that kind of makes me laugh because like that's often the vision is like, oh, within your community you'll have these best friends and those will be the ones that you do everything with, and like your lover pool, like those will be like the people that you eat with every day and stuff. And I consistently have seen over my years here that like people's best friends and lovers are often at one of the other tri-communities in the area or even in Rutledge. So like it's often the case that like, you know, I was in Skyhouse, an income sharing community, and my lover was at Sandhill, you know, and like that's not unusual at all. So even within people's tight-knit groups, they might get their closest social needs met somewhere else, and you can't control that kind of thing.
Just a quick question on the screening thing. How often have you had to knock people back that haven't met, you know, the criteria that you want, that have wanted to come to your places and it hasn't fit?
Do you, let me make sure I'm understanding. You mean people who have already joined and then it's been a disappointment, or you mean you say no, you can't join?
Yeah.
The latter. Okay.
I'd say early on that was more of an issue. Like certainly when it was like Dancing Rabbit was just like this idea, and it was still sort of amorphous, and people would come in and be like, I want to start a summer camp, and we'd be like, nah, that's not what we're doing, you know, like. So once the more clear, the more the vision was realized, people could see whether they fit in, and they would self-select out. So even when we first moved here and we were, you know, we had land but we only had 1 or 2 buildings, people would come and they'd think it was something that it wasn't. You know, they had their vision and they wanted this to match that when it didn't really. And so there were times where we had to say, like, I don't think what you want really fits here. I'd still say that 95% of the time, 99% of the time, I'm not sure, people self-select and they realize that themselves. But occasionally you have to actually tell someone like, wow, this doesn't seem like it's the right fit. But most people will figure that out on their own.
Yeah, we have a fairly long get-to-know-you period before you can apply to live at Red Earth Farms. You can apply to be a resident right away after visiting for a week, but then you have to reside at Red Earth Farms for 6 months before applying to be a member, and that is the only time when you can start leasing land. So before that, you're supposed to just camp and not do anything permanent on the land. And so during that time, as Tony's saying, like people at Red Earth often can figure out whether it's a good match or not. We've only had to say, we've never had to say no to someone who is applying for membership, and we've never said no to someone applying for residency, but we have said we want to come back to this again. So we've said, you know, when someone applied for residency, there was a point where we were like, we don't really know you well enough yet. I know it's been 6 months, it's been however many weeks, but we're not really sure this is a good enough fit for that. And so a few weeks later, he actually left. So yeah, that was the only time we had to do that.
I would say there's 2 major ways that you're screening people, and one of them, with a good articulation of what you're doing and what the reality of your situation, which is not that hard to accomplish, that one's met pretty well. So we rarely get somebody who comes out and visits who really is grossly wrong about what we're doing. That almost never happens. However, the trickier piece is, are we in the same tribe? Do we like the way we smell? Which the articulation doesn't help with very much. And it is one of the poignancies in trying to do this social change work is we live in a pretty much a mainstream alienated culture, at least in the U.S. I don't really know Australian, but or South Korean, but in the U.S. there are people who really hunger for connection and community for the right reasons, but they don't have the skills for it to work. It's about mainly social skills and ability to hear and take feedback, and there's a bunch of things there. And so we don't want to encourage them because we don't want projects on some level, but they're actually, the vision matches up and it would be good for them, but it's like it's not a fit. And so that continues to happen. I wouldn't say that that's lessened over time for us. I think we are more accurate and knowing more quickly and rarely making mistakes about encouraging somebody when we shouldn't. We've gotten better about that, but the incidence of people whom we're going to not encourage, I don't think that's changed over time.
It's more of a not encouraging rather than a...
There are times when we just have to say no. I mean, it still happens.
And note that like Sandhill is a much closer and
right.
knit community, and so there the social connection is
Higher bar.
paramount.
Higher bar.
Whereas at Dancing Rabbit and Red Earth, it's sort of like, oh, do you fit with the program? Do you fit with the vision, values? Are you like, if you're like, as long as you're not like making a huge problem, then we'll usually give you a try.
Right.
We have had to, I just want to say, like, a key thing at Red Earth Farms, before you can lease land, you have to have a whole land use plan of what you're going to do on your leasehold, like everything that you think you're going to build and how many people you expect to have. We have had a number of times when someone presents their land use plan or their draft land use plan, and we're like, no, like, you can't do that yet, or you can't do that there, or, and there was a person who left who then came back later, Joan, who with her previous partner, they wanted to put a cob thing on a what's the stone urbanite foundation and stuff, and while they were residents, and we nixed it, and then they left. But then Joan came back later and had a different plan that we approved. So that's a point where the rubber hits the road at Red Earth Farms. It's like, what are you actually going to do here?
And who makes those decisions? I want to get other people in who haven't gotten a chance to ask the question yet, and then I'll come back to you.
It's consensus at Red Earth.
Miguel?
This is probably unrealistic in the fact that it's the Midwest, but have you ever had to deal with the issue of someone not being an American resident? Or
Sure. Yeah.
How do you deal with it?
Different ways.
Sorry.
Marriage.
How do we deal with non-U.S. residents that want to be members? Stan, the long-term member at Sandhill, is Canadian born, and so he was, for a number of years, he was illegally in the U.S. And so then, but it turned out that there were amnesty things that allowed, so now he is legal now. And we weren't sure how we were going to handle that. There were times, there was a stretch when we thought he may get deported and we would just lose him. It was tricky because we didn't see an easy path. So some people do it in some communities through sham marriages. I mean, consenting people, but it's not a marriage. It's a convenience for immigration
Not
purposes.
just in communities, just to be clear.
Well,
That's a widespread practice.
Right, but what I'm saying is some communities use that solution to solve it. We did not. We thought about it. That's not what we did. And it turns out that we had a happy ending or a soft landing because there was an amnesty that allowed it to work out. But so we have had that issue.
We've never had citizenship issues, but we've had Canadians who wanted to live here but didn't want to leave their good health care behind.
And we had a Canadian who wanted to stay and chose to go back home for financial reasons.
Interesting, that's all Canadian examples. Okay, Fiona.
Well, I am particularly interested, which you kind of covered, like your selection process for community, who gets to join the community. So can you just go into that a little bit more in depth about how you made the selection and what your criteria is for a member to join, and what the grace period or courtship period or whatever you want to call it is before there's a final commitment, and then also expound a little bit on the personality issues that have been a major stumbling block to making community work, because I'm sure there's that kind of, in the early phases, a little bit of a desperation to get people on board, and then you might be like, oh my God, that was a big mistake. And then an issue I grapple with a lot is this whole notion of community is great, and yet we don't want you. In the wider world, it's like, if you've got drug addicts, whatever, it's like we're not really excluding all these people, but at the same time, they can just you speak on both of those, the selection process and...
That'll take us an hour.
So let's
How long are we expecting this to go?
We've got about
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
Till 10:30.
Over a little bit more.
Okay.
So the question is about membership selection process, and particularly issues that are like alcoholism, mental illness, the really tough ones. So let's do the general one first.
I'll go first. We're looking for two things. I just mentioned it in the exchange with Marita. Both, do you fit the vision? Usually that's easy. I mean, it's usually pretty easy to sort that out. In fact, we rarely get people even coming that that's a bad fit for. The trickier thing is, do we feel like there's enough social cohesion or promise? So a standard we have is we need to see at least one member in the group advocating for that person to join. So there's excitement about them being a member rather than just acceptance. So it has to be positive rather than non-negative, at least on some level. We'll also address if somebody's irritated or having a problem with somebody's behavior, we'll definitely slow down and look at that. We will protect time where the members will have a closed meeting to assess, is there something that's come up with this person so that there's no barrier to their saying it in their presence, with the commitment that we will give a summary of what comes up in that conversation to the person afterwards, but their presence will not inhibit exploring what that might be. Does that make sense? Now, and that often means, hey, this is what's come up rather than this is a do or die conversation, and if this doesn't get addressed, it's probably going to be a fatal flaw. However, you might have a response, and so we want to give people a chance for some give and take, depending on how egregious the behavior is. So I would say that for us, social skills is a more paramount, and Tony made a good point that we have a higher bar perhaps on that because we depend on cohesion. I mean, one person who's difficult in a group of 6 is really tough, where it's a lot different in a group of 75. So we're looking at a different screen about what we're willing to try on and what we expect of people in their facility. And a key thing, for instance, is how do they hear feedback, or how open are they to it, or defensive? That kind of thing. How well do they listen to what other people say? How well can they articulate their feelings? Questions like this. Probably the best screen for us is not an interview, but watching them in a meeting where they're observing and then talking to them afterwards about how they experienced it. We can see volumes in a short period of time through that experience. Now, you asked, and the question of how much we can stretch to take in people who are challenging, this is a very case-by-case thing, and I think we feel like what our primary thing is to protect the quality of life and the vibrancy for the people who are there. It's an endless, I mean, there's no doubt there are people who genuinely in terms of need, and we think they're pretty limited in what we can do, and we're worried about swamping the lifeboat by having everybody come and join us. And so there's, I mean, whether we're making good choices, these are painful and personal choices, and we do the best we can. It doesn't mean we're expecting everybody to be whole and perfect and no damage, because otherwise we'd never have anybody. But we have to make an assessment of what we think we can handle.
So I'd say, you know, from about a year in, Dancing Rabbit had essentially the same process as Sandhill, and that since then it's been gradually shifting to, like, where in the long distance, when we're a 500-person village, it will be easier and easier for someone to join, and the test will just be like, do you agree to abide by these covenants? Great, welcome, you know, thanks for coming, and here's your, you know, find a home to buy, or, you know, land to build on, you know. And so, like, right now we're in a stage where it's like moving closer and closer to that. But early on, when we were only 6 people ourselves, we were in that same place of, like, we actually have to have a really strong connection with this person. We need to, you know, they need to fit with our vision and our values, which was in some ways even more important and less clear for us because we were still mostly on paper. You know, so we've seen that shift over time. We've always had at least a 3 months, but usually 6 months sort of acquaintanceship period before someone became a full member. And early on, that was plenty long enough. When you're eating dinner with someone every day, when you are living with them day to day, you know almost always before 6 months whether someone's going to work or not. It's rare that 6 months goes by and then there's like some surprising thing where you're like, oh my God, this person's actually annoying. You know, it's like you have already figured out that they're annoying or that they're challenging or whatever. Now that we're a village, 6 months, there's people I'm like, what's that person's name again? Like, you know, like they're just like 6 months goes by in a blink and I hardly get to know them, and I have to trust that there are other people who will have raised red flags if there are issues. And so again, the people who I do eat with day to day, I do get to know really well, but the people across the village, I may not get to know at all. And so I mentioned from early on we took on like more or less Sandhill's system and grew from there. But when we first got here, we didn't know yet. We were ignorant. We didn't have a system. And we were also, we had just moved to Missouri. We didn't even have land yet. We were here for a year before we had land. We had the craziest people in the world came to visit us and wanted to join because it doesn't have land yet. A bunch of people like still figuring their stuff out. If you're ready to join that, you got to be a little bit crazy because, like, I mean, the people who already joined us, they knew us personally. We had this connection. These are people who like found us on the internet, and like, you know, all we had was a double-wide trailer and an idea, and so it's like, not surprisingly, we got people with like not great social skills who are a little bit desperate. Who were just waiting for anything interesting to happen in Missouri. I'm not exactly sure what was going on, but and we were not prepared to say no to people. We just didn't. We were, and somewhat we were in that, like, we were desperate to grow, and so we wanted, and we also just like didn't have the experience yet. Like, as you further, like, what I've seen was at first it took us a while to figure out, like, oh, this is not going to work, and then we would still take a long time before we took action on it. Now it's gotten faster that we can tell this isn't going to work, and then we take action right away to tell that person, to give them the feedback, hey, what you're doing is not working for us, or I don't think there's a good fit here, or whatever it is. And so there were experiences where it took, you know, months or even years of a challenging person before things finally were addressed, and now we just don't let that happen because we've gained that experience. And it is hard to have that discernment until you've been through it. And so there is going to be some level as a new community where you're going to get to that experience and you're like, oh, come on, well, maybe we can still make it work. And you might be right. You don't know yet. You don't know. And so it's really hard. And like, and as far as like dealing with, you know, mental illness and alcoholism and, you know, drug addiction, like, I would say that at Dancing Rabbit we probably have sometimes it feels like we actually attract more than our fair share of people who have like diagnosable mental illness, but I think in reality there's just a lot of it out there, and that we more or less get our sort of slice of it from the American populace. And so, and it's challenging, and we deal with it, and we have a lot of diversity, and people relate in different ways, and yet there are still limits to what we can, like, we're not a place where we can really support people who are you know, like, especially when they're brand new and they haven't developed the social connections here, and so they don't have any social capital yet in the community, and they decide to go off their medication and are starting to act really crazy, really weird, or we just don't know what to do, or we don't know how to handle them. We don't even know what to do yet, and like, we've often had to like call their parents or call their friends from before here and get support from them in some other way, because we just don't have the connection with them to make it feel right to take care of them in that way at that point.
Yeah, so I don't know if you noticed, but it might be too early to call it a best practice, but it's very common in communities to have like a 6-month-ish long period where you're getting to know a new person and they're getting to know you before you make any firm commitment to each other. And we had observed that before we founded Red Earth and adopted that. We've had two very fortunate things that have helped us with our membership selection. One is the way we set up our financing. So we haven't talked about money. It's really interesting that hasn't really come up yet. But how the land is purchased and how other people buy into it is super important to figure out early on. And one of the things that was very important to us was that we not be in the position you're talking about where we're desperate for new members. We really needed to not have to pay off our mortgage at certain fixed times so that we would need people to lease new land so that we could pay him. And so we had this angel investor who actually said, here's a loan, you know, the land was $90,000. We paid our leasehold, the 2 leaseholds that we were originally leasing from our investor who purchased the land, made up, you know, $30,000. We still had $60,000 debt roughly plus interest. And he set a very low interest and said, pay me whenever someone leases land. And I want to check in with you every 3 years and make sure that you know, I want my money back. You know, I want the opportunity to get my money back every 3 years. And so we would refinance at that point if he wanted his money back. And that was key because it meant that we didn't have to say yes to anybody. You know, we could take our time. And I really recommend if you can find financing in that kind of arrangement, it's great. The other super fortunate thing was that we found land right next to 2 other awesome communities that also had similar values to ours in terms of, environmental sustainability, growing food, renewable energy, living off the land, and so forth. And so most of the people who end up at Red Earth Farms have spent a lot of time in the area already. They've been at Dancing Rabbit or at Sandhill. They've been interns or work exchangers, and we've gotten to know them in that way. There have only been some people who've come, out of the blue that haven't been familiar to us in some way. So that meant that we had even a longer getting to know you period before having to make a decision. It's hard to get started at Red Earth Farms. We don't have any common infrastructure at all on purpose. We wanted it to be a very affordable place where someone who wanted to farm a few acres could come and get started without having a lot of money. And so people are allowed to start to build a collective house for yoga or whatever they want to do on their own initiative and then set up the financing however they want. But we aren't doing that as a community. And so people come there and there's raw land and there's nothing, and they have to figure out where to go to the bathroom, where to get their water, like all those basic needs, how to take care of them. So we rarely have people come who are not extremely highly functional in terms of hard skills and soft skills, like getting along with people as well as doing stuff on the land. But it's heartbreaking when someone does come or writes us an email and says, I'm a single mother, I have 3 children between 2 and 9. I don't have much money, but I have some skills, like I can do massage and I can tincture things and I can do astrology, I'm a good writer. And we're like, I don't think you should even spend the money and time to come visit, because you're not going to make it unless you can join an existing leasehold, and we don't have any that are available to new families at this point. That's not our position right now, but in the past we've had to say that to people, and it's hard for me to see that we're not a community that can absorb everyone. But that was not our vision from the start. There are communities with that vision. There are communities that are like, we are serving the poor, we will take you off the street, we will find you work, come and join our community. That's not us. And so it can be really heartbreaking, but I think it's important up front to get clear about what are those boundaries, and then hold those boundaries. Don't feel like you have to take on people just because your heart is broken. It could kill your community.
I want to make a connection to the last piece. To remember, the very first classroom experience we did was on diversity. An element of that conversation which we did not explore that first Saturday is the limits of diversity. And this is what we're bumping up to. You can't be all things to all people. And it's very tender having those conversations, and yet you need to have a way to get at when is somebody being asked to stretch too far. People's individual answers in the community will not be all the same. And somebody will want, and you're talking not about theoretical people, but a real live person in front of you, and somebody will say, I want this person as a member. I want to stretch and include them. And somebody else will say, no, it's too much. That's a very tender and difficult conversation. Now, I don't want to go any further except to note it here and say that when we get to the power and leadership conversation, there's going to have a very strong analog when we get to it, because that also is a difficult conversation to have. Many of these things aren't like, what's the right answer? How can you talk about it? And if you don't have a way to do that, now you got a problem. Okay, so I'm trying to connect dots about where we have been before, where we are now, and where we're headed. Okay.
So Miguel, I did see your hand, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do a closing thing instead. So you have 2.5 minutes or so, each of you. What's the thing you didn't get to say that you really want a room full of potential community founders to hear? Okay.
All right. My piece would be, don't do it. You got to talk me into it. I mean, I think my job, and I get a chance to talk to people who have the dream of starting a community a lot. And my first thing I do is I pour a 5-gallon bucket of cold water over their heads. I'm going to say, you need to burn to do this. And if you do, God bless you, and we need more communities. But it's hard. It is much, much easier to join a successful community than it is to start one.
I think the hardest part for me has always been figuring out how to stay true to the vision and the values that we brought together to create the community, while also still being flexible and open and compromising over time. and knowing when to stand firm and when to let go. And that's, in some ways, like that's an inherent question in consensus decision making, or in any decision making really, is to know, like, when do you hold firm to your value, when do you block a consensus that feels like it's going to change things too much, and when do you say, no, this is a principle that I am going to stand on and this is the right choice. And having that discernment is incredibly hard, and there have been numerous points, especially early on, where that was really tricky to negotiate. And so I just want to like name that, like, there will be nights where you are crying and not sure which direction to go with that, when to let go, and not knowing, do I stand firm or do I let this go, even if it means I might leave this community, or even if it means that my vision might die a little bit. And you have to be ready to live through that pain and still come out the other side joyous.
It's hard to follow that. I want you all to not underestimate the power of group dynamics and learning how to get along with the other crazy humans in the world, because they're not you. Like, nobody else is me. And just getting that is huge. It's like, I'm a different person from you. I have different values. I have a different history. Where do you come from? What is your history? How do you arrive at this place? Like, where can we meet? Where's the tension? Like, how can we soften around that tension and invite each other in a little bit more? And like, all of the skills that allow us to listen to other people, really get them on a deep level and see where they're coming from, I think it's more important and more difficult than like the hard skills of like building a building or how to get your rainwater and stuff. Like, if you can do that stuff but you can't get along, it won't get off the ground. And even if you don't start a community, if you go and join a community and it doesn't have those skills, like, it won't be any fun. So I would go out and get those skills if you don't feel like you have them, and bring them wherever you go in the world, because they're going to help.